Emily Davis had always believed that her training would keep her steady under pressure. It was what had made her rise through the ranks of the police force so quickly. The city streets knew her as a dedicated officer who followed the rules and made sure others did too. She had built her career on doing what was right, or at least what she believed was right. But on that one fateful night, everything she had stood for came crumbling down. It started like any other pursuit. The sound of sirens echoing in the night, the flash of red and blue lights in the rearview mirror, the adrenaline rush of the chase was something she knew well. But this time was different. This time, the stakes were higher. The driver in the car she was chasing wasn't stopping, and Emily's instincts told her that it was more than a routine stop. She was right, but not in the way she expected. As the chase continued through the winding streets, Emily's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, her mind calculating the next move. She saw the suspect swerve dangerously down an alleyway, and her heart raced. She couldn't lose him, not after everything she had done to catch him. Her sirens screamed louder, but he didn't slow down. Instead, he made a sharp left into a narrow street. She followed without hesitation, knowing that this could be the moment where everything was decided. But it was also the moment that everything would fall apart. The suspect's car slammed into a row of parked vehicles and then into a wall. But there was no time to think, there was only time to act. Emily jumped from her car and sprinted toward the wreck, her gun drawn, her training taking over. She reached the car just as the suspect was pulling himself out, his face twisted in anger and fear. Emily shouted for him to stop, but he kept moving, reaching for something hidden in his jacket. Her hand hesitated just for a second, but that second was all it took to make the decision. The gun fired once, and then again. The suspect dropped to the ground, and Emily stood over him, her breath right, her heart pounding. The world seemed to slow as she realized what she had done, the adrenaline of the chase still pumping through her veins. She hadn't meant to kill him, not really, but in that moment it didn't matter. The man was dead, and she had pulled the trigger. The aftermath was swift and unforgiving. In the days that followed, the city erupted in outrage. Her fellow officers looked at her with a mix of confusion and pity. The media painted her as a trigger-happy cop who had acted recklessly. Some called her a hero for ending the chase, others branded her a murderer. The internal investigation was relentless. Her own department turned on her. The weight of what she had done pressed down on her chest, suffocating her until she couldn't breathe. But it wasn't just the guilt, it was the knowledge that everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed, was now meaningless. The day of her trial came too soon, and she walked into the courtroom like a criminal. Even though she had never intended for any of it to happen, she took the stand and told her story as best as she could, but the words felt hollow, and the eyes of the jury burned into her soul, as if they could see through the layers of her intentions and straight into her guilt. She got back to that moment when she had fired the gun. That first shot had been out of fear and instinct, the second out of a need to survive. But to the world it didn't matter. All that mattered was the outcome: the dead man lying in the street, the lives shattered, and the one person who would have to pay for it all, Emily Davis. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as Emily took her seat, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. Her lawyer had prepared her for the worst, but nothing could have truly prepared her for the weight of the moment. As the prosecutor stood and began his opening statement, Emily felt her stomach twist. He spoke of a reckless cop who had taken the law into her own hands and ended an innocent life. He painted her as someone who had lost control, who had acted with malice, even though the facts didn't support it. His words echoed through the room like a hammer striking metal, and Emily could do nothing but sit in silence and let the accusations wash over her. The more he spoke, the more the walls around her seemed to close in. Her defense was next, and Emily tried to focus on the voice of her lawyer, but it was hard to concentrate when all she could hear were the words of the prosecutor ringing in her ears. He argued that she had acted in self-defense, that she had no choice but to shoot when the suspect reached for a weapon. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. The jury had already made up their minds. The evidence against her was overwhelming. The video footage of the chase, the witness statements, the statements from her fellow officers, all pointed to the same conclusion: Emily had made a deadly mistake. There was no denying it. As the days of the trial wore on, Emily grew more and more disillusioned with the process. The courtroom felt like a stage with everyone playing their roles. But no one seemed interested in the truth, only in the narrative that was easiest to believe. She wanted to stand up and scream that it hadn't been her fault, that she hadn't wanted any of this, but the words stuck in her throat. She knew it wouldn't matter. She knew that no matter what she said, she was already guilty in the eyes of the public, in the eyes of the jury. The final day of the trial arrived, and Emily sat in the same chair she had sat in every day, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the murmurs around her as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. Her mind raced as she tried to prepare herself for whatever was coming. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't stop the fear from creeping in. Her lawyer had promised her a chance at a lighter sentence, but Emily knew better. She knew that the system had already decided her fate, and now it was just a matter of hearing the official words that would seal her destiny. The gavel came down with a deafening crack, and Emily's world fell apart. Guilty, the word echoed in her ears as the judge read it aloud, and she felt her body go cold. She had never imagined that this would be how it would end. Her life now belonged to the state. The crowd erupted in a mix of cheers and jeers, but Emily couldn't hear them. All she could hear was the deafening silence in her own mind. She had failed the system, she had failed herself, and now she would pay the price. Her sentence was handed down moments later, death by lethal injection. The words felt like a death sentence for her soul too. The days blurred together after that as Emily was escorted back to her cell, the reality of what had just happened finally sinking in. The gravity of her situation was impossible to ignore. There was no escaping what was coming, and no one to blame but herself. She was left with nothing but the bitter taste of regret and the weight of a future she couldn't change. Emily sat in her cell staring at the cold grey walls around her. Her mind raced, but it felt like it was moving through a fog. Everything seemed distant and unreal. She was numb to the world outside, to the shouts and cries from other inmates that echoed down the halls. Her body was physically present in the prison, but her mind was elsewhere, trapped in a cycle of guilt and regret that she couldn't escape. The sounds of her past mistakes replaying over and over in her head. She had always prided herself on her ability to stay calm, to make quick decisions under pressure. But this time it had been different. This time she had failed miserably. She thought back to that night over and over, trying to make sense of it, trying to find some way to explain what had happened, why she had pulled the trigger, why she hadn't hesitated when she had always been so sure of herself before. But every time she thought about it, the answer remained the same. She hadn't had a choice. Had she, the second shot had been instinctive, driven by fear and the will to survive, but now it felt like a curse that would haunt her forever. Her trial had been a blur after the verdict. The days seemed to slip away into an endless sea of paperwork, visits from her lawyer, and prison routines that felt meaningless. She spent her nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, her thoughts tangled in a web of guilt and hopelessness. There was no future for her now, no way out. She had already been sentenced to death, and no one was coming to save her. No one would ever believe that she had done what she had out of fear, that it had been a moment of panic that had led her to kill a man she hadn't meant to end alive. She had been given a date, the day that would mark the end of everything, the day the state would decide her fate. The countdown had begun, but in those long, quiet moments in her cell, she began to wonder if there was a way to fight it, if there was any chance left for her to find redemption. She thought about Max, her dog, the one creature that still seemed to care about her, the one thing that hadn't turned its back on her through all of this. Max had been there waiting for her. Every time she walked back into a small prison cell, he never judged her, he never looked at her with the same eyes as everyone else. He simply stayed close, and in his presence, Emily could almost feel a sense of peace, a brief reprieve from the chaos in her mind. But even that was slipping away. She hadn't seen Max in a while. The prison had deemed him a security risk and placed him in a separate area away from her. The last time she had seen him, he had looked at her with a sadness in his eyes, as though he knew what was coming, as though he knew that there was nothing left for them here. She had pleaded with the guards to allow her to see him, but it was no use. He was just another casualty in the fallout of her life. Each day passed with agonizing slowness, and Emily began to lose hope entirely. She had been given every opportunity to fight for her life, but now it felt like there was nothing left to hold on to, no reason to keep going, no reason to believe that things could ever be different. The walls of her cell closed in tighter and tighter until it felt like the whole world was suffocating her. She had no purpose anymore, no meaning to the life she had once known. But even in the darkness, she couldn't help but wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for something more. Maybe Max knew something she didn't. Maybe there was still a way out of this nightmare. The night before her execution, Emily lay in her small cell staring at the ceiling. Once again, her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and regrets. She had tried to prepare herself for this moment, but nothing could prepare her for the emptiness she felt. The reality of what was coming was almost too much to bear. She had no hope, no future, no chance to make things right. The only thing that kept her grounded was the memory of Max, her German shepherd, who had been by her side through it all. Max had always been there for her from the first day she joined the force, when she was just starting out and trying to prove herself, to the day she had been arrested. Max had always been her constant companion, the one thing that never judged her no matter what happened in her life. He had been the only one who seemed to understand the weight she carried, and now he was gone, taken from her by the very system she had once served. Emily thought about him every day, wondering where he was and what he was doing. She could still hear his bark in her mind, his tail wagging as he greeted her after a long day on the job. He had always been the loyal one, always by her side, but now that loyalty had been taken away from her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she had lost more than just a pet. She had lost her only true friend in the world. Suddenly there was a sound outside her cell, the shuffle of footsteps coming closer, and Emily's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone, not this late at night. It could only be one of the guards coming to check on her, or maybe it was a last-minute visit from her lawyer. But the footsteps didn't stop. They lingered just outside the bars of her cell. The sound of a key turning in the lock echoed through the silence, and Emily sat up quickly, her pulse racing as the door creaked open and a familiar face appeared. It was Officer Kane, an old colleague from the force, someone she hadn't seen in months. He was standing in front of her, looking tired and worn, as if he had been through a battle of his own. Emily stared at him in confusion, wondering what he was doing here at this hour, why he had come to visit her at the most inopportune moment of her life. He stepped forward, hesitated for a moment, and then spoke, his voice low and urgent. "I need to talk to you, Emily. There's something you need to know, something that could change everything." Her mind was spinning as he spoke. The words hung in the air like a warning, but before she could ask what he meant, Max suddenly appeared at the door of the cell. His familiar bark echoed down the hall, and Emily's heart leaped in her chest. She hadn't seen him in so long, hadn't heard his bark in what felt like forever. But there he was, standing at the door, as if he had never left. The officers around him stepped back as Max growled low in his throat, his body tense and protective. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she realized what was happening. Max wasn't just here by coincidence. He had come for a reason, and that reason was her. Emily's heart began to race as she stood up slowly, not sure what to expect. The dog's eyes locked onto hers, as if he knew exactly what she needed. And in that moment, everything changed. She wasn't alone anymore. She wasn't helpless anymore. She had Max, and somehow she knew that together they could find a way out of this nightmare. Max stood in the doorway, eyes locked onto Emily, as if he knew exactly what was happening. His stance was firm and protective. The low growl vibrating in his chest was a warning to anyone who dared to come closer. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She hadn't seen him in what felt like forever, but there he was, as if nothing had changed, as if the world outside didn't matter anymore. In that moment, all that mattered was that Max was here, and something was about to change. Officer Kane took a step forward, his eyes flicking nervously between Emily and the dog, his voice low and urgent. "We don't have much time, Emily. You need to listen to me." But Emily couldn't take her eyes off Max. He was so close now, his body tense, his eyes never leaving the officer, as if he was waiting for something. Emily couldn't understand what was happening or why Max was here now, but she felt something shift inside her, something that told her she had to trust him, she had to trust the dog who had always been there for her, even when no one else was. Max, Emily whispered, her voice shaking as she took a cautious step forward. The dog's eyes softened for a moment, as if recognizing her voice. Then he let out a sharp bark, his tail wagging briefly. As he took a step toward her, Emily reached out her hand, feeling the rush of relief flood through her body. She couldn't explain it, but she knew that this was no coincidence. Max had come here for a reason, and now she had to figure out what that reason was. Kane looked over his shoulder at the dog, his face pale. "I don't know what's going on here, but this is bigger than you think," he said, his voice trembling with urgency. "Emily, you have to trust me. This is your chance. You have to escape now." Emily's eyes flicked between the officer and Max, still uncertain about what was happening. She didn't know if she could trust Kane. She had no reason to, but Max seemed to know what he was talking about. The officer stepped back, his hands raised in surrender. "I've been trying to figure out a way to get you out of here, and it's not just the system working against you. Someone in the department is trying to cover up what really happened that night. Someone doesn't want the truth to come out, but you need to get out of here before it's too late." Emily's mind was racing as she processed his words. She couldn't understand everything he was saying, but one thing was clear: this was her chance to escape, and she couldn't let it slip away. Max gave another sharp bark, his eyes never leaving Emily's face, his body moving as if he was waiting for her to act. Emily took a deep breath, her heart racing with fear and adrenaline as she turned toward the officer. "How do I get out of here?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. Kane's eyes flickered with something close to hope. "Follow me," he said, and then he turned on his heel and disappeared down the hallway. Without thinking, Emily followed her dog, leading the way, her mind spinning with questions. But she couldn't afford to stop, not now, not when she had a chance to escape the prison that had become her world. She trusted Max more than anything, and right now she had to follow his lead. They moved quickly through the halls, the sound of Max's paws echoing against the stone floor as they rounded corners and slipped through darkened corridors. Emily's heart raced with every step, but she couldn't look back, she couldn't hesitate. This was her only chance to get out, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. They moved through the prison's dark hallways, as if shadows themselves, their footsteps quiet but quick. Max led the way, his body low and alert, his ears perked at every sound. The growls that escaped him were low and threatening. Every step forward was another step into the unknown. Emily's heart raced in her chest, her pulse pounding in her ears. The fear of being caught still gripped her, but there was something else too, something more powerful than fear. It was the adrenaline, the hope that had been buried so deep inside her that she had forgotten what it felt like to truly believe in something. Kane led them around a corner into a hallway she had never seen before. It was narrow and deserted, the walls closing in on them. As they moved further into the prison's depths, she could feel the weight of the place pressing down on her. With each step, she couldn't help but think about everything that had brought her here: the trial, the verdict, the hopelessness that had consumed her. But now none of that mattered anymore. The only thing that mattered was the chance to escape, to get out of this hellhole and somehow find redemption, if that was even possible. "Keep moving," Kane whispered, his voice urgent. They had reached a door at the end of the hallway, and he paused to check the lock before glancing around nervously. Emily didn't ask questions, she just followed his lead. Max was at her side as always, his presence a silent reassurance that she wasn't alone. She had no idea how he had known she needed him this badly, but she was grateful for it in that moment. He was her anchor in a storm of chaos and confusion. Kane unlocked the door, and they slipped through quickly into a small room that was dimly lit by a single flickering light bulb overhead. It looked like a storage closet or some kind of utility room, the walls lined with old supplies and crates of equipment she didn't have time to focus on. But as soon as they stepped inside, Kane closed the door behind them and locked it softly, his eyes darting around the room as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. "Now what?" Emily whispered, her voice shaking. She didn't want to know what the next move would be. She just wanted to get out of there. She wanted to feel the fresh air on her face, the freedom she hadn't known in months. The only thing that kept her from falling apart was Max's calm presence beside her as she tried to steady her breath. Kane took a deep breath and nodded toward a small window at the back of the room. "We're almost there," he said, his voice steady, but there was a tension in it now that hadn't been there before. "There's a tunnel just beyond this room. It leads out to the old grounds." He paused and looked at Emily, his eyes filled with something she couldn't read. "This is it, Emily. This is your only chance to make it out alive." She looked at him, unsure of what to say. The reality of what was happening started to sink in. This was really happening. She was actually going to escape, and the thought terrified her more than anything she had faced before. Her hands trembled at her sides, but Max was right there by her side, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel completely alone. "Let's go," she said finally, her voice firm, though the fear still lingered in the pit of her stomach. Kane nodded and moved toward the window, quickly pushing aside the old supplies that were blocking the way. He turned back to Emily and Max one last time. "This is your chance," he repeated before he disappeared into the darkness of the tunnel. Emily hesitated for only a moment before following Kane into the tunnel. Max was right behind her, his presence a constant reassurance in the darkness. The air in the tunnel was thick and musty with the smell of old earth and stone. As they moved deeper into the underground passage, Emily's heart pounded in her chest with every step. The tunnel seemed endless and claustrophobic, the walls closing in on her as if trying to swallow them whole. But she couldn't stop now. There was no turning back. She had already come too far. Kane led the way with steady steps, his flashlight flickering in the darkness ahead of them, the beam of light cutting through the shadows as it illuminated the path forward. Emily's thoughts raced. She couldn't believe this was really happening. It all felt like a dream, too surreal to be true. But as she glanced down at Max, she saw the determination in his eyes, the loyalty and strength that had never wavered no matter what had happened to her. He had always been there for her, and now he was guiding her toward freedom. The tunnel seemed to stretch on for miles with no end in sight, and with every passing moment, Emily could feel the weight of time pressing down on her. Every sound, every movement felt like it could alert someone to their escape. But still they pushed forward, every step taking them closer to a chance at life outside the prison walls. "I know it feels like forever, but we're almost there." Kane's voice broke through the silence, and Emily nodded even though she didn't feel like she could trust her own thoughts. She just had to keep going. There was nothing else she could do. She had to believe that this escape was her only shot at freedom, that everything she had been through had led her to this moment. Suddenly Max stopped in his tracks, his ears perked, and his nose twitched. He growled low in his throat, and Emily froze, her breath caught in her chest as she scanned the darkness ahead of them. "What is it, Max?" she whispered. But the dog didn't move. He was focused on something ahead, his body tense and alert. Kane turned to her and raised a hand to signal for them to stay quiet. A faint sound reached their ears, the sound of footsteps, distant but growing louder with each passing second. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know how much longer they had before someone found them, before they were caught, and the hope that had been building inside her began to fade. She could feel the panic rising in her chest. She wasn't ready to go back to that place, not after everything she had been through, not after everything she had fought for. Kane looked at Emily, his expression tight with urgency. "We need to move now," he whispered before turning back toward the path ahead. Max gave one final growl and then darted forward, leading them through the darkness, his movements swift and sure, the light from Kane's flashlight bobbing in the dark. As they moved quickly down the tunnel, Emily's pulse raced, but she followed Max, trusting the dog to lead them to safety. With every step, she felt closer to something she hadn't felt in so long: freedom, the air outside the walls, the life she had lost, but could maybe still find again if she was lucky. They finally reached the end of the tunnel, a small hatch hidden beneath a pile of old crates and dirt. Kane moved quickly, clearing the debris with practiced hands. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she saw the faint glimmer of moonlight beyond the hatch. She was so close, she could almost taste it. But just as Kane lifted the hatch to open it, a loud noise echoed down the tunnel, the sound of running footsteps, too close to ignore.